Hello. Hi. Before the others come onto the stage, we're just going to do a little warm-up, if that's okay. My name's Nikki Birch, and I'm the producer of the podcast Backlisted.
Woo!
Hi. This is John. You all know John Mitchinson.
So lovely to be here.
For those of you who don't know the podcast Backlisted, apologies, this won't last very long, and then we'll get on to the main show. But it's our first trip to New York.
So we're just going to soak up every
We are going to soak it up, yeah, just for a little bit. Bear with us. And so, John, what have you been doing since you have been in New York?
I've been locked in our apartment writing. I've got a deadline. I've got to deliver a script on Friday. So I haven't been doing much sightseeing, Nikki, but I have been thinking.
This is true to form.
Yeah.
He's been doing writing. I think I've been here 2 days, been to the opera, been to Connecticut, been out everywhere, been up and down the city.
Did a run this morning, something that will never
Went for
happen.
a run in Central Park. You know, nothing's changed, basically. It's really nice here.
Great.
So before we start, we just thought we'd talk a little bit about Backlisted, the podcast. It's been going for 10 years. Has anybody recently started listening to the podcast, like in the last year? Hello. Thank you.
Thank you.
You might have heard the Elizabeth Taylor episode or the Sylvia Townsend Warner episode, which were this year, and we're going to be talking a bit more about them.
We will.
Was anybody here? Is anyone here a patron? Oh,
Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much.
In a very real sense, you're why we're here.
We literally couldn't have done it without you. So thank you. Was anyone here for the COVID years?
Oh, look.
Guys.
Good. That might come up a little in conversation.
It might do. It might do. And has anybody been listening? Now, don't worry if nobody has. Since we started in 2015.
Holy
Legends.
God! Amazing.
Legends. Month in the country. Free book for all of you. Thank you so much. Okay, another last quiz. Okay, I'm assuming everyone here is a book lover. So I'd like all book lovers to raise their hand. Book readers, even. Let's
just readers. No judgment, Nikki.
Okay.
No judgment.
Okay. Well, I want you to keep your hands up.
Keep them up.
Keep your hands up, okay? And we're just going to do a little test. Okay, it won't last very long, don't worry. Right. Can you put your hand down, okay? Down, if you... No. Wait, there's more to this. If...
God, this is complicated.
If you haven't read any Salinger. So you keep your hands up if you have read Salinger.
Okay,
yeah?
cool.
Okay.
Put your hands down if you haven't read any John Cheever.
Haven't read John Cheever, hand down. Okay.
Right.
If you haven't read Sylvia Townsend Warner, put your hands down. Okay.
And if you haven't read Elizabeth Taylor, put your hands down.
Okay, so
you guys are the experts.
In the room, we know who to come to.
We'll be depending on you as we get underway. That's fascinating.
We've got a really big group of readers in the building. So
good. Well,
it's really lovely to see you, all of you. One more thing, we've got another show on Wednesday at Bleecker Street, the bitter end, 6:30. It'd be lovely to see someone.
How on earth we're going to do that without Miller? I have no idea.
I know.
We'll figure it out.
We've got some freebies to try and bribe you there. So if you come there, we're giving everybody who comes a bookmark.
Great. Nikki?
It's a metallic bookmark. It's better than nothing. Anyway, it's been lovely to meet you all, and we're going to go crack on with the show. Also, quick wave to everyone who's watching on the streaming.
Indeed.
Hello.
Thank you.
All right, I'll leave you in John's capable hands.
Now I'm going to invite onto the stage our guests for this evening. Woman with water first. That's very important. Right, are you guys ready to come and take your places? Oh. Thank you. Thank you all for agreeing to do this. It's very exciting for us to be in New York. And I think we're going to start recording now. So you've done all the usual phones off and all that kind of stuff. Does the music play, Nikki? Yes, it does. Good evening and welcome to Backlisted, the podcast that gives new life to old books. It's a special birthday edition of Backlisted this evening, and it's coming to you live from New York City, from the amazing venue, the 92nd Street Y. And the subject for this evening is also, we're here for our 10th birthday, but we should also say it's the 100th anniversary of the New Yorker magazine. So I think maybe a round of applause for those two amazing milestones. The subject of this evening's podcast is a backlisted hero, William Maxwell, who was for 40 years a fiction editor at the New Yorker. We're going to be talking about his work through the prism of four of those extraordinary, he published some of the great writers of the 20th century, from Nabokov, John Updike, through to four of the writers we're going to discuss this evening. J.D. Salinger, who we might call the protege, John Cheever, who we might call the difficult one, Sylvia Townsend Warner, his pen friend, and Elizabeth Taylor, who was a discovery. Now, there are two writers from the UK, two writers from the US, two writers that we've covered in detail on previous backlisteds, and two that we've never really formally done, Salinger and Cheever, we've never formally done. We have got a marvellous panel to discuss that tonight. I'm delighted to welcome back to Backlisted Jenny Egan, who has been with us twice to discuss the work of Anthony Trollope, and before that, Mrs. Gaskell. And we've been plotting about possibly other books to do in the future. But it's great to have Jenny with us. Next to Jenny, we have the Maxwell de nos jours, the fiction editor of today's New Yorker, Deborah Treisman. Deborah also is the host for the only other books podcast I regularly listen to and think, man, I really wish we turned in something that good, which is the New Yorker Fiction podcast. And then Alec Wilkinson, who is a writer of both fiction and non-fiction, has been a writer at the New Yorker since 1980, but is also the author of a remarkable memoir about his relationship with William Maxwell called My Mentor, which was published in 2002. So across, we've got a team really across the range. We're going to talk about editing, the relationship between editing and writing. It's also hugely important to remember that William Maxwell, as well as being an editor, was a very considerable novelist in his own right and short story writer. I was very fortunate to be part of the team at Harville back in the 1990s, who astonishingly still to me, we published Maxwell's work in the UK for the first time. And in 1997, I got to meet him and his wife Emily at their apartment not very far from here. One of the great moments certainly in my publishing life. But let's start with the New Yorker. I'm going to ask you, Jenny, to begin with. The New Yorker, as a writer, as a New York writer growing up, how much did the New Yorker loom as a kind of as a force in your life in terms of a place that you wanted to be published, or where you would go and look for other writers who you were kind of to be inspired by?
I mean, it loomed enormously. I think not probably until college, because I didn't know I wanted to be a writer actually until then. But once I got to college, I remember, looking for it and feeling like it was my guide to sort of what I needed to be and do, which was a little strange because it did publish predominantly men.
Yes.
And it felt also like very much the adult world. I think maybe what I was really seeing was that it was a different generation than mine. And so it worried me because I thought, I don't know if I can really be part of this. It feels like it's something that I can enjoy and appreciate, but can't really see myself in the midst of. And part of it is that I was just kind of a late bloomer, talent-wise. But when I was in New York and sort of scrambling to be a writer and reading the slush pile and trying to find my way into literary parties and meet people, at that point, I remember that I and other sort of aspiring writers, we scoured the magazine and discussed each week the stories. There were usually two, a long one and a short one, and watched it very carefully. So it loomed enormously.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard really to think that something is, 100 years is a long time, right? And Maxwell stood down from his position, or was stood down at the age of 67, which is now kind of 50 years ago. So is there any, Deborah, is there any kind of sense of that period, that kind of period, which I guess was the 40 years from the late 30s through to the 70s, that still exists in the building, in the work that you do?
Well, definitely. I mean, definitely. There's a legacy of how to approach fiction, how to edit it, how to think about it, how to discuss it. There was also, in my own life, I started at The New Yorker in '97, so about 20 years after Maxwell retired. I never met him personally, but Roger Angell was still in place, and Roger had been there, 50 years. Roger was there basically his whole life because his mother was the first fiction editor. And so a lot of the history of it lived on in Roger, and I wouldn't say he embodied Maxwell's take on fiction. He embodied his own take, but you could get a sense of what meetings had been like in the past through him.
Yeah, I mean, it was because back in the day they published a lot more fiction, didn't they? There were sort of 3 stories at one point each for each week.
Yeah, I mean, usually 2, because there was in the beginning. Actually, I think until the '70s, there was no rubric. There was nothing that said something was fiction. So you just had a title. Right. You didn't even see who had written it till you got to the end. You just started reading, and the assumption was if it was in the first person, people would assume it was a memoir, which wasn't always true. And there were a lot of sort of hybrids. I mean, a lot of Frank O'Connor's work was mainly directly autobiographical, but is spoken of as these were short stories. So I've forgotten the question.
No,
I've gone off.
Just trying to the idea that there was so much fiction being going into circulation.
So what there was, I think, in the sort of '80s, '90s was this system where there were 2 stories a week, and they were actually called the A story and the B story, and things were taken as A and B stories, which may have been a hangover from the very early days with the first editor, Harold Ross, who used to ask fiction editors to give each story a grade from A to C- or something, and then he would pay a fee according to what grade the story got. That was how he assessed how much to pay for it. And Maxwell always gave everything an A.
An A.
But the A story was considered to be the sort of serious literary fiction, and the B story was a lighter thing.
Sure.
What was then called a casual, and now is more like what you would see in the Shouts and Murmurs section, with humor.
As well, we'll come back. So, Alec, you maybe a little bit of background on how you came to write for The New Yorker, but Maxwell was very important kind of mentor from a fairly early age. You were 24 when you first met him, and he had been a very good friend of your father's. You want to just explain a little bit of the background of how you got to know him?
Well, Maxwell and his wife Emily lived down the road from my parents on a country road in northern Westchester. And Maxwell was my father's closest friend. They would ride to the train with each other every day over in Croton. And so I knew Maxwell as a friend of my parents through my entire growing up. Maxwell once told me that he had me on his lap when I was 3 days old. But when I had something, I had wanted to be a musician. I didn't want it. I became a writer because I thought that I had a subject to write about, which was the year I'd spent being a policeman in Wellfleet, Massachusetts on Cape Cod. And I thought, nobody's ever written a book about being a policeman in a small town. I will write this book and I'll get rich, and then I can go back to being a musician and it'll just be easy street from then on. So I was sort of working along, and my father said to Bill, would you look at something that Alec has written? And so he did. And from then on, he read every sentence I wrote, I suppose, for 20 plus years. We would sit together side by side at various tables in his house in Westchester, in the apartment. They lived at 544 East 86th.
And did you have a sense of how remarkable that was? I mean, you were getting kind of
no, I had no idea.
tuition
I
from...
knew Maxwell was a friend of my parents. I had no real idea of who he was in the world. Yeah. And thankfully, because I was kind of awfully humbled when I did find out, I'm the only writer Maxwell ever trained, and that's because every other writer that he had to deal with already knew how to write. So I was really sort of a Pygmalion kind of project.
That's a really interesting point. I mean, that must be somewhat the same for you, Deborah. Now, as you're most of the stuff that gets submitted isn't. There used to be a huge slush pile, didn't there, of people?
Oh, there's still a huge slush pile.
Is there?
Yeah. I'm not working on it for the most part. You know, I mean, it's all read, and then the things that make it to me are things that someone thought were worth taking seriously.
But I guess all of the writers there were maybe start. Let's go in with Salinger, because he's the one that probably of all that generation that Bill Maxwell edited, he's the one that has come to define. Cheever called them a clique of little Hemingways, of New Yorker writers, but no. Salinger called Cheever and the rest of them a clique of little Hemingways, and he was rejected by Maxwell for several times. But having come back from the war, he was very determined to get his work published by the New Yorker. And when it finally happened, I think the thing that seemed to change it for him was he came in, met Maxwell, and they got on really, really well. And from there on, he kind of felt he could trust Maxwell. But the kind of paranoia and the madness came later. But I think even in those early exchanges, you can see an editor, the story, which was just called, at that stage, called The Banana Fish. Maxwell told him he wasn't going to publish it, and they agreed that he would go away and rewrite it, and he changed the structure of the story quite dramatically. So this is a sort of moment, an interesting moment in the development both of a writer's career, but also of Maxwell. By that stage, he'd been in the job for a long time, and he had the confidence to do it. But how do you? This will come up again in all of these writers that we're going to discuss. How do you deal, Jenny, when you send in something that you think is good, and the person, as it were, on the end of the phone says, "I'm not going to publish this." Has that happened to you?
Yeah. Oh, yes. I mean, usually it's a multi-staged process. Yeah. I guess the bottom line is I really seek out feedback, because even though it's never fun to find out that something isn't perfect, it never is perfect. So finding out the ways in which it isn't is a necessary step to try to make it better. So, I mean, I'm in a writing group and we meet regularly, and so I experience this feeling of learning that people have issues with what I'm doing on a pretty regular basis. And initially, there's always a stage of like rage and misery. And resolutions to not speak to that person again, never submit work again, whatever it is. But then that's almost immediately supplanted by a kind of problem-solving rustling in my brain that is very useful in terms of fixing things. I mean, I love the story about A Perfect Day for Banana Fish, because as I understand it, what was missing was the entire first scene of the story. Yeah. And if you think of it without that, all we have is this guy going into the water with a little girl, which definitely has a slightly creepy edge to it, especially, I think, for a contemporary reader. But when you also know that in a very economical way that we learn only through dialogue, that this guy has, he's crashed a car, he has problems with trees, he's insulting people, like he's real, and he's come back from the war different. So once we know that, and he takes this little girl out, the tension is ratcheted so high, and then, of course, he commits suicide. So, I mean, talk about a great piece of feedback to be told this isn't complete, do more. I mean, it made the story.
And there is that, though, that the thing that comes up again and again when with Maxwell is this, that both generous, like you say, Deborah, giving everything, awarding everything an A, but also being kind of, not giving in easily when he felt that something was wrong. And there were, at that point, there were also that he knew that he seems to have become a bit of a buffer between the rest of the New Yorker and Salinger himself, because he knew he'd got his trust. And he was always very, very particular about not speaking in public about working with. Although we've got a little clip, actually, it'd be nice to hear his voice. Should we just play the clip?
It is true that once the proofreader came to me and said, this sentence has to have a comma in it. And it was just going to the printer, and I couldn't reach Salinger. And it seemed clear to me that it needed a comma, and I had great faith in that particular proofreader. And so I said, all right. And he was very sad afterwards because he didn't want that comma. It wasn't necessary. And that's what it was like editing Salinger, really. You couldn't safely put a comma into him, and I made a terrible mistake in agreeing to it. Most of the things about editing was that I was trying to perform for them the function that my wife does for me, that is to say, a detached person seeing when they were not always writing their best, and if there was something that wasn't their best, it could be made their best. Say, look, that's all the editing amounted to, really. To have such a love for them and such a sense of what their best was, that if they, through fatigue or one thing or another, had a sloppy paragraph, get them to fix it.
Get them to fix it. Are those still conversations that you're having on a regular basis, Deborah? Is it? Yeah,
absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, not everyone gets upset about a comma, but there is a tendency of writers to get upset about commas because the New Yorker puts them everywhere. But also in fiction, we're allowed to ignore those rules. I mean, I think what Maxwell had was the art of encouragement, right? It's not saying, look, this paragraph is sloppy, do better. It was saying, the story is already good. How much better can it be if we make this transition, if we do this or that? And there's a way of not being insulting while you're editing, of acknowledging that you know what's good in the story. That's why you're bothering to work on it.
And that, Alec, and that trust thing, I mean, how did he go about building that? Was it, was it that he was, because he was a writer, he was able to communicate in a way that other writers kind of connected to?
Well, I think he also edited less than most people in the department and than most people do now. I mean, Roger Angell always said, Roger was a taker-outer and Maxwell was a keeper-inner. There was a funny story I saw that Maxwell used to give an Elizabeth Taylor story. This should come up when we talk about Elizabeth Taylor. He used to give an Elizabeth Taylor story to aspiring editors as a test, and he said, if they touched a hair of its head, by God, they were no editors. And just the fact that, he wanted someone to acknowledge when a work was already good. It didn't need anything. So he had that sort of respect for success, for the writer's goal, and so on. And I think when it wasn't there, if you start from that basis, then the writer trusts you to say when it's not quite there.
And Alec, when you were kind of learning your craft, I mean, was he encouraging to you? Did he read it and give you notes, or?
No, I mean, I'm never in my roughly 40 years at the New Yorker can I think of anybody encouraging me. It's not that.
It's not that culture, right?
At least in my experience, it's not that kind of place. You're a professional writer. You do your work. It's supposed to be good. You sit down. If you're working with an editor, the task is to make it better, surely. But I never had anybody that I can think of who said, "Oh, I think this is." I mean, you know, when the editor-in-chief, when the piece was accepted, would write you a note or call you or something, and would say, this is. I would hear praise there, but in the collegial give and take of preparing a story for a piece of work for publication. I don't know. I never had that experience. I never got to work with Deborah, and I see the deprivation I was subjected to as a result.
Yeah, I think it's a difference between fiction and nonfiction, and the staff writers are just supposed to buck up, and they've got their assignments, and they do them.
But I think you're right about
fiction writers. They're sending their soul.
That's right. Those of us.
I know you have your soul too.
Those of us who aspire to be writers do, inject our souls into it. But I do think you're right in the sense that I do think you're right. Yeah.
I mean, I'm just getting this sort of sense too of there being a kind of almost sort of Yoda-like thing, whereas you go and the famous story is Salinger going and driving out to the Maxwells to read the first draft of Catcher in the Rye, which is one of those sort of great heroic stories. But I also have this idea, that he's not getting kind of feedback. It's more Maxwell sitting there nodding and saying, good.
Maxwell did say to me when I asked him what the experience is like, I said, what was Salinger's manner? He said, he knew what he'd done.
Yeah.
He knew what he had in Catcher in the Rye.
And interestingly, there had been two sort of lead-up drafts, stories that became part of Catcher in the Rye that had already gone to the New Yorker. So he'd already had somewhat of an experience of working in that area with them.
I mean, it is a remarkable trajectory, and by the time it's in 1965, when Hapworth 1924, it's practically the whole magazine.
Yeah.
I mean, is that conceivable today, that there would be a writer who would be able to command the whole magazine?
In a fiction issue?
Yeah. Well,
yeah, I'm thinking that the last time we had something like that was many years ago, maybe about 20 years ago, when we did 3 long stories by Alice Munro.
Alice Munro, but mid-60s, it's changing.
In that period of time, there were things that occupied the whole magazine. They were more often nonfiction, things like John Hersey's Hiroshima, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring.
Baldwin.
But so it wasn't unheard of, and it would fill a whole issue, and then you didn't have to work very hard that week if you weren't the fiction editor.
Well, I mean, Salinger, as I already said, was kind of he clearly, it mattered to him that he was published in the New Yorker. And the people he was kind of taking potshots at were people like John Cheever. And Cheever had 121 stories. There's a very small number of writers who've had over 100 published. I think Mavis Gallant, Cheever.
John O'Hara.
Yeah. I mean, so he was kind of, by the time Salinger's being published in the late 50s, Cheever was sort of the New Yorker establishment. But famously, Cheever and Maxwell had a very difficult relationship. And Jenny, you've got a good story about this, I know.
Well, I know, it's a great, just a great comment on sort of writer jealousy that Cheever was, I mean, Salinger comparatively published so much less.
Yeah.
And yet...
Only 13 stories in the New Yorker, although
and when he
they were
published
big ones.
And his books, even of short fiction, would be at the top of bestseller lists for long periods of time, which I can't really think of a case of that in recent history at all. So Cheever, with all of his publications, apparently was getting really annoyed about, about Salinger's success. And then in the middle of this, he submitted a story that William Maxwell wanted to apparently cut severely. And Cheever drank quite a bit and phoned William Maxwell in a rage. And Cheever's own account of that conversation is this quote: "You cut that short story, and I'll never write another story for you or anybody else. You can get that goddamn sixth-rate Salinger to write your goddamn short stories, but don't expect anything more from me. If you want to slam a door on somebody's genitals, find yourself another victim."
And actually, that was a complicated story because I think Maxwell had felt that the story had two different endings, and he'd cut one of them and put it into type. And Cheever had been in the office and looked at it and sort of noticed that it had, you know, a big chunk had been cut, which also meant he would get paid less.
Yeah.
And at the time, he'd sort of said, well, that's all right. And then he went away and started drinking. And he was reading Life magazine, a profile of Salinger. And then afterwards, Maxwell claimed that he'd just been trying it out. He wanted him to read it that way, and it wasn't supposed to be going to press, but it wasn't clear if that was true.
There was this thing, wasn't there, that Cheever also thought that Maxwell wanted to kill him, and that had attempted to kill him at a party where he fell out of he was pushed out of a window, a first-floor window, I hasten to add, quite close to some very vicious railings, which he wasn't impaled on, but he had this belief. I mean, did Maxwell himself kind of, he was sort of mildly amused by that, wasn't he?
Maxwell was not an aggressive person. I think Cheever was something of a serial fabulist, and I think...
There's that story about the cat coming in with the goldfish, which Maxwell says was made up, that he'd gone to see the Maxwells and everything was going well, and then the cat came in with a goldfish in its mouth.
Well, Maxwell used to say that Cheever would tell him things as if they had occurred, except that at a certain point Maxwell realized they couldn't have occurred, and that he realized Cheever was trying out fictional ideas on him. And so I don't know how much of, I would, in a little bit of a contest, I would trust Maxwell's impression more than I would trust Cheever's.
Yeah, I mean...
And if Maxwell said he didn't push Cheever out the window, I think Maxwell was right about it. And I don't know whether Cheever was sober when he fell out of the window.
Yeah, true. And there's a very funny story that he tells.
But I think it's a hard thing for, I don't know if Deborah feels this way, but there is something, I think one of the differences is when we were talking about injecting soul, is that a writer of my kind, somebody who's writing about the actual world, a figurative writer, is going to hand his work into Remnick or to Gottlieb or to Sean or something like that, not to an independent editor. But I think that it's very hard for fiction writers, I would guess, one would become very dependent on one's editor because there's your meal ticket.
Yeah.
And Maxwell was surprised when he retired at how few of the writers he had worked with which ones sort of fell away and which became even better friends after he no longer held their purse strings, as it were. But I think it's a very complex relationship.
Jenny, do you have are there things that you're looking for in an editor? You say you're quite collaborative, you like getting the feedback.
Yeah.
But do you have people who you absolutely, a small group of people you absolutely trust?
Yes, I do. Although they don't always agree with each other. That's why, for me, a group is better than a person, because it's not like everything anyone says is going to be quite right. And in the end, there's sort of a synthesis that has to happen. I will just say, having worked with Deborah now for I'm not sure how many years, I feel a kind of mental synergy with you that is really profound. And I think where I noticed that maybe even the most was doing nonfiction with Deborah, because I wrote an incredibly long piece, more than double what I had been assigned. And the editing process felt very effortless. I was really struck by that. It just felt almost like when Deborah had edited it, I kind of thought I had written it that way already. And she was just pointing out the way I had actually written it, when in fact that wasn't true. So, ideally, if you've worked with someone for a long time, there can be this kind of shorthand dynamic that develops. And I feel that. I feel very lucky to have that.
Yeah, and we should talk a little bit about definitely the change that's happened in the 50 years since Maxwell stopped. I mean, it's the commissioning, the New Yorker has reflected the change in commissioning across publishing generally. There are a lot more women being published. But he did publish some extraordinary women. I mean, Sylvia Townsend Warner, who we're going to talk about next, is maybe what's fascinating with her is that he met her for the first time when she came into the office. And kind of, obviously, it's almost like a sort of love at first sight thing. He just thought she was kind of sort of magnificent and interesting and strange. All of the things that she, in fact, we know from her writing that she was. And then later on, he even said that the writer that he personally, as a writer, felt he'd learnt the most from was Sylvia Townsend Warner. And she published a lot of stories with the New Yorker through him. But the thing that really is remarkable is their correspondence. I think they wrote 1,300 letters. And if anyone wants a kind of, it's not often that you can recommend books of correspondence, but The Element of Lavishness is an astonishing book, full of some of their best stories. The quote that he uses, I think, is a lovely one. He says, "The personal correspondence of writers feeds on a leftover energy. There is also the element of lavishness, of enjoying the fact that they're throwing away one of their better efforts, for the chances of any given letter surviving is 50-50 at most." Well, luckily, they both kept their correspondence, and he became her literary executor. And I think wasn't one of your jobs having to type up the correspondence at one point?
That was when I moved to New York from Cape Cod. The first way I made money was Bill hired me paid me to type Sylvia Townsend Warner letters that he was. She wrote all her letters by hand, and so they all had to be typed up for him. So I started doing that.
But I think they only ever met twice, and yet the intimacy of the letters are pretty remarkable. And I think, you were talking about that trust thing. I think he trusted her view on his own fiction really well. There's a great early letter from 1950 where Time Will Darken It, his novel, has not done brilliantly and quite a few critics have failed to understand it. So she sent him this. This is one of the nicest things I've read from one writer to another. "But no reviewers ever understand one's books, and if they praise them, they understand them even less. Praising reviewers are like those shop women who thrust a hat on one's head, a hat that's like the opening of Judgment Scroll in which all one's sins are briefly and dispassionately entered, and then stand back and say that it's exactly the hat that Madam needs to bring out her face. I've never yet had a praising review that did not send me slinking and howling under my breath to kneel in some dark corner and pray that the horn would sound for me and the worms come for me that same night. The horn doesn't and the worms don't, and somehow one recovers one's natural powers of oblivion and goes on writing. Yeah, that's the funny thing, isn't it? Good reviews are almost as bad as... Do you have that? Are you suspicious of good reviews?
I'm pretty glad to get a good review. I'll take it.
Yeah. She was a remarkable writer, and her novels, the Corner That Held Them, and Lolly Willows in particular, have this sort of strange. You almost feel she was kind of prefiguring a lot of the folk horror tropes that are coming. And one of the things that I didn't realize until I'd really read the correspondence is that the sort of the fairy books, the elfin books, were something that Maxwell was really passionate about and encouraged her. I don't think she got much encouragement in the UK. So those books, when they were published as Kingdom of Elfin, did much better in the States than they did back in the UK.
Did she publish stories like that? It seems like her stories were generally more kind of naturalistic.
Later.
They were, but it was later, and he kind of, even after he'd, I think, stepped down, she lived, I think, until she died in maybe 1978, I think. So, I mean, it's hard now to think. If you said New Yorker writers, you probably wouldn't think of Sylvia Townsend Warner, would you?
Not many people do.
No.
You know, she's not really read here now, I don't think.
There is, although I think she is published. I notice that there's a kind of a, both with her and with Elizabeth Taylor, there is what Virago did in the 1970s, which is to republish a lot of them. NYRB are doing again in the 21st century. And I think some of her, certainly Lolly Willows, and maybe The Corner That Held Them as well, has been republished.
I had never read her, I will confess that.
Yeah, I don't think she's generally out there in the culture, but again, Maxwell had this kind of curious ability to find stuff that he liked. But as I say, the letters are. I mean, do you, Deborah, now in your job, is correspondence a thing? Emails?
I wish people wrote letters like that.
Yeah.
You know, that's a dead art, really, because no one does it.
No.
I mean, you're not going to find a collection of my emails with Jenny, you know, that someone will read on a podcast.
No.
I mean, there might be like a very personal, touching one once in a while.
But you're a fan of the Frank and Connor correspondence, the happiness of getting it down right.
I mean, Maxwell's letters were amazing. They were really amazing. And with Sylvia Townsend Warner, it goes far beyond editing and far beyond the work at hand.
And some of those, some of
friendship.
Yeah, and also kind of whole narratives that you wouldn't get, I think, anywhere else.
Yeah.
As he said, lavishly wasted. Do you think, Alec, that his letters are the best of his literary output?
Best of his what?
Literary output.
Literary output. No, not by half, but I like them.
No.
But sorry.
I think it's.
Stepped on
I agree with you, but I do think there are people I know who prefer to read the letters than to read the fiction, or find the fiction more difficult. Well, we'll talk about the fiction in a moment.
Well, I think it exemplifies, or it shows an entirely different. It shows the deep sympathy that he had, both for writers and for writing. I mean, I think one of the things that made Maxwell, and I think he's a far better writer than editor.
Interesting.
Made him such a wonderful editor is that he was in touch with the place where stories and novels come from, the other domain. He was always captivated by the image of the old storyteller at the crossroads, led around by the blind old storyteller, the Homer sort of figure. And that's what I think made him so capable of a profound understanding of another writer's intentions. And as I say, I think he was a greater writer than he was an editor. But If you think of the list of writers who might be associated with him, Mavis Gallant, John Updike, Salinger, Eudora Welty, Updike, O'Hara, Nabokov.
Yeah.
The range is stunning. You would think that if that list were there, some editor would have to go into another editor's office and say, I like Nabokov, but I can't get it. Could you do it? But Maxwell could do all of that. The depth of his literary awareness, his certitude in the art of storytelling. He was essentially a storyteller. And it is what made him, I think, so receptive.
He attempted to leave the New Yorker twice, in fact.
He did,
left,
yeah.
And then kind of to do his own work,
right.
And then came back.
Well, he was one of those writers, most writers teach, I think, and he was one of those writers who didn't, he had moments in books. The Chateau was on the New York Times bestseller list. The various books worked for certain moments, but he wasn't able to actually make a living from just writing, the way Salinger did or Updike did or other people. He wasn't lucky that way, so he needed the New Yorker. He worked there only 3 days a week, but he needed that check.
Yeah, he 3 days a week, and the other 4 days he was writing.
He was writing.
And he had he would write, he'd have breakfast and then not.
Right. Well, and I think that his great novel, his masterpiece, is So Long, See You Tomorrow, the very short, clearly of the 20th century, one of the 5 great American short novels. And he said that one of the reasons he thought he was able to devote his attention to it so thoroughly was that he was finally writing 5 days a week.
Yeah.
It was after
and
he retired.
That old cliche about, sorry, this is such a long novel, I didn't have time to write a short one.
Yeah.
Yeah. We should touch on the least well-known of the, I think Sylvia Townsend Warner's unknown, but I think Elizabeth Taylor is even more unknown. In fact, I think somebody said recently that she's known for being unknown now at all. She had a brief period. She's an English novelist, again operating from the sort of the 40s through to the early 70s, and published 11 novels. But really came again to prominence. She came to prominence through the New Yorker, through being picked out of somewhere by Bill Maxwell, and she was. Obviously she had issues with her name. She said, "Men write to me and ask for a picture of me in my bikini. My husband thinks I should send one and shake them, but I have not got a bikini." But she wrote 35 stories, were published in the New Yorker between 1948 and 1969. And obviously her novels were being published at that point as well. But again, it's sort of fascinating where this came from. What was it that turned Maxwell onto her? But there's a lovely thing in the correspondence. She writes, I guess there are quite a lot of women who 20th century, mid-20th century women, Rose Macaulay, Elizabeth Bowen, Rosamund Lehman, Sybil Bedford, Barbara Pym, Barbara Cummins, who were all writing roughly at the same time. All of them got picked up later by Virago. Many of them have been picked up by NYRB. But it's fascinating to me that Maxwell, maybe not alone, but he was certainly, in American terms, he was aware of a number of them and published a number of them. Not Barbara Cummins, but Elizabeth Taylor, chief among them. But the thing he seems to go for, what I want to try and see if we can come to a consensus on is what you've talked, Alec, about the range, but what was the thing that in each of these writers attracted him to it? There's a letter he sends her, which I think is lovely, where he talks about, there's a story called The Rose, the Mauve, and the White. And he writes to her, "In the morning, Charles went down to the garden to practice calling for 3 cheers. I remembered the excitement, the bliss of reading that sentence for the first time in a manuscript that arrived on my desk across the ocean If an editor can see that this sentence is written by a great writer, and he can understand that most people could not write it, he himself is an editor of genius. Well, he's patting himself on the back there as well, but I'm fascinated by this idea that he really, really operated on the sentence level, Maxwell, and whether that is something, Deborah, that the perfectly sort of tuned, honed sentence, whether that's still a thing in New Yorker fiction.
It is still a thing. It's just not the only thing.
Yeah.
Right. And it varies from writer to writer. Some writers are writing a story whole cloth. Some writers are writing line by line, and the quality of the sentences can vary. You can like a story for what it does over the course of the story, rather than from what it does in a paragraph. You know. But I think he had a particular attraction to sort of precision in language and to delicacy in language, and he liked stories that didn't move too quickly.
Yeah.
He liked sort of pacing.
That sort of, I mean, a lot of Elizabeth Taylor's work is what you might call a kind of domestic realism, which is a mode that he himself, the natural history of home is a phrase he used about his own writing.
Yeah.
So you can sort of see that there's was there a danger, I mean, did it become too claustrophobic, too formulaic? I mean, there have been criticisms of the New Yorker for kind of peddling one particular form of storytelling.
Yeah. In my opinion, it's never actually been the case.
No.
It's that people have picked on certain strands of what was being done in the New Yorker. I mean, what is remarkable to me is that Maxwell went to bat, for instance, for Eudora Welty.
Yeah.
Fought like crazy to get her in the magazine. He had a story of hers in 1946, and he wrote to Gus Lebrano, who was the head of the fiction department then. He said, "This piece violates every canon of this magazine, and it's absolutely first-rate fiction, with wonderful things all through it, which raise it for me above anything we've run in years. There must surely come a time when any magazine, when the usual editorial canons have to be laid aside in favor of a work of the highest quality." And you know, you wouldn't think that the person who loves Elizabeth Taylor would love Eudora Welty. They're very, very different writers. That letter didn't work, by the way. He couldn't get Welty into the magazine until Harold Ross left. Harold Ross's response to that letter was, "Maxwell can't make me arty."
I love that. But Ross had some very peculiar, I mean, it was very much, New Yorker stories have to be kind of more or less set in New York and not offend anybody, and
Sort of sophisticated, funny.
Yeah.
I mean, it was begun as a humor magazine.
Yeah.
That's where he was coming from.
But one thing I feel like I see in the four writers we're talking about is an interest in the kind of, the sort of delicate membrane of regular life, sort of conventional life, and this seething, hidden other world of, you know, conflict and violence and anger and secrets that is always threatening to burst out from behind it. And that's pretty interesting. I mean, in a way, you could say all fiction is about that in some sense. But I felt like I saw that in all of these writers. I mean, in Salinger, it feels very much like it's about the war. He had such a brutal battle experience, fought in the Battle of the Bulge, and you know, went on shore in Normandy. But in some of the others, it's different. But I have one little quote, if I can read it, from Elizabeth Taylor, whom I also had not read. So I'm glad you gave me the occasion. So this is a couple who are on a kind of group tour. He's a widower, she's married, and they're having an affair. And they're trying to hide it from the other people on the tour, so they go away to another place to spend the night so that they can be together more obviously before they part completely. And things start to go wrong immediately. Their hotel is terrible, and they're now being served a horrible meal. Phil is the woman. Phil knew they would not complain about the horrible coffee that was coming. The more monstrous the egoist, she's talking about the proprietor of the restaurant, the more monstrous the egoist she had observed from long practice, the more normal people hope to uphold the fabrication, either for ease or from a terror of any kind of collapse. She did not know. She was sure, though, as she praised the stringy chicken hoisting the unlovable man's self-infatuation a notch higher, that she did so because she feared him falling to pieces.
Wow.
So there's this sense of mainstream life as this delicate fiction, really, that we have to work so hard to keep intact.
I mean, that's really interesting, because she gets kind of tarred with this brush as the famous Mrs. Palfrey at the Claremont was shortlisted for the Booker, and Saul Bellow famously said, I hear the faint tinkle of teacups. This idea that it's some sort of middle class. It's a lot of the Elizabeth Taylor is fantastically dark. And that sense of repressed anger and of people's lives falling apart. There's a great, again, Maxwell writing to us saying, in the past you found in the company of people far above, or else considerably below them in the social scale. And he said, I prefer those. I see them, the characters only you can deal with properly, the not respectable, ungroupable, raffish, incorrigible, hanging about outside your house on this marvelous spring day, waiting for you to come out and deal with them since nobody else can. And she writes back rather sadly, I keep looking, but there's just no one there. It's like living in outer space. The more I fret, the worse it is. So write what you will, Bill dear, and I will think about it deeply, but never mention it, or I might drop down dead. And she gradually, her stories are kind of fade out. But she was, I was amazed to see this, that they published a big chunk of one of her novels in the magazine. And she earned good money. They were paid good money. It was something like, in today's money, it would have been something like £90,000 or $10,000. That's the economics for a lot of these writers. They had a first look agreement, right, where they were paid more money if they were exclusive.
Yeah.
Presumably the economics have changed dramatically. You don't have to go into this exact details, although I'm sure you'll be fascinated. But if you were getting published regularly in the New Yorker as a writer in the 50s, that was kind of that paid for your life.
Yeah, someone like Cheever or Updike would publish 5 or 6 stories or 7 stories in a year, right? And if you had a first look agreement, you got a bonus for each additional story in the same year. So yeah, they could live off it. And in fact, I think very late in life, Mavis Gallant was living off just her signing bonus for her contract, which was not a lot of money, but
amazing.
So it was a way of staying afloat, and that's partly why Cheever had the big break with Maxwell, because he kept asking for a raise.
And the swimmer, he demanded a raise, and then they just stopped. They sort of, I think, after the swimmer, at 64, there were only 6 more Cheever stories published. But then he went on, his collected stories was a top 10 in 1978, won the Pulitzer, and was a top 10 bestseller.
But he also found out, strangely, he was being paid less than all the other, first look writers, which I'm not sure what was behind that.
Let's go back to the point that you made earlier, Alec. I'm interested in this idea also of anger, that Maxwell has this kind of reputation for, almost saintly reputation for being incredibly patient, incredibly generous. But he did have a kind of, he did have a dark side too. And that is obviously there in the fiction. Do you want to say a little bit about, we should talk about his fiction, because it's an important part of, I think, what made him a good editor was that he was continually struggling with his own work. But I think he said it didn't occur to him at first, but he had everything he needed as a writer pretty much by the age of 25.
Right. Well, I mean, he was a species of autobiographical writer, and so he drew heavily. He was marked more or less by the death of his mother when he was, I think he would have been about 10 or 11 in the influenza epidemic, and he returns to it in So Long, See You Tomorrow. It's what They Came Like Swallows is about. He was really struck by the conversations that took place in his childhood, as he used to say, in the air above his head, and the behaviors of the aunts and uncles and the houses he was in and out of, and his love of home. He was home-loving all of his life. One of the things for me that made it possible for me to see a way to being a writer was that I so loved and admired Bill through my whole, when I was 12, when I was 16, or whenever Maxwell would come into the house, I would be aware of him among my parents' friends because he was so radiant and so full of life and so loving and kind. And to look into his eyes was to feel acknowledged, even as a child, by an adult, which is not a feeling I associate with any other adults from that period of my life. But he offered a way for me to see that it was possible to be sensitive, it was possible to be strange, it was possible to be eccentric and devoted and obsessed, and to pursue the things that were of greatest meaning for oneself. And so he was a model for me in that way, and that meant an enormous amount to me. But he wasn't he was, I don't think, a saintly figure. I think he was as prone to losing his temper. He was very civilized. I mean, the New Yorker that I came into, William Shawn's New Yorker, was a very elegant place. I mean, it was a house full of nutty people, but all of whom conducted themselves with this great, everybody was gathered together, to be in the monastery away from the rest of the world, which is why it was the deepest and greatest and most unbelievable irony that Tina Brown should have been made editor of the magazine, because everybody who was at the New Yorker stood against everything that Vanity Fair was for and did not want to be in the world that way. I like Tina Brown, by the way. I'm not trying to take a dig at her.
The magazine's, let's be
honest,
I mean,
it was a strange thing that these two things should be seen somehow to be forced together like some kind of, atomic reaction, a brute force sort of gesture. But anyway, Maxwell, he was an elegant guy, and so he didn't get angry in public, probably. But I'm sure when he got angry, it was Titanic. He got angry at me twice, and I never forgot it.
No.
I felt scorched. It was a laser hit.
You can definitely feel that.
Yeah.
I mean, going back to New Yorker today, Deborah, and the ability, do you think it's still the case that the New Yorker can find and make a writer in the way that perhaps in Maxwell's period, it was still possible for it to be, or has fiction, the way we read fiction and the way we think about fiction and the way has that changed? That New Yorker now is, you go there yes, you do go there to discover new voices, but you kind of know that pretty much everybody in there is going to be, they're going to have a deal, they're going to be being published. They're not. It's not the first flush of discovery.
Well, this week's story is by someone who hasn't published a book and doesn't have an agent.
Amazing.
So
that's genuinely amazing. That's amazing to hear.
And who is in his 20s. So yes, it can still happen. It can still happen. Those are the most exciting times when you see talent before everybody else has seen it. Or you, not everybody else, but you bring it to the world before others have brought it to the world. So it still is, but yes, there's more of an industry now, and people are more aware of the industry, and they're going through MFAs and being taught about the industry and being taught how to sell themselves and so on. So there's a little bit of a sort of industrialization of the apprenticeship as a writer in a way that there wasn't back then.
And do you think if Bill Maxwell came to the New Yorker offices today, he would recognize it? It would still feel kind of like the place he worked in?
Not very. Not very. I mean, it's a different. I miss our old offices. You know, there were sort of warrens and offices down hallways, and the one I started in on 43rd Street, there was a lunchroom with a jukebox. You know, it was just a different kind of place. Now it's much more corporate feeling.
Jenny, I'm aware that we're getting sort of running out of time, but just in terms of the New Yorker in your life, is it still something that really means a huge amount to you? I mean,
it definitely does, both as a reader, but also just personally. I mean, I published my first story there. I was 26. I didn't have an agent. And even though it wasn't, you know, in the end, it was up to me to come up with more good work. You know, one story doesn't a career make, but it helped a lot with, you know, my father thinking that I wasn't like wasting my life being a temp. And it just felt like a stroke of legitimacy that was just undeniable. And that was huge for me at that point. And I feel like some of the real kind of publishing milestones that I've had have actually been in the New Yorker. I mean, again, this is Deborah in part. I don't know what William Maxwell would have thought of the one that I, you know, turned in basically to be tweeted. I mean, this is a funny thing about this conversation is, you know, all of this is pre-internet, and of course we live in such a different world now. But it was really thrilling to write really a novella, work on it with Deborah, and then have the New Yorker tweet it. It felt like a real event. And it was really exciting. Like, I'll never forget that. So it's for me, it's really a pole star of my career for sure.
Amazing. And I'm pretty sure that Maxwell would have. I mean, he loved the magazine. That comes through from the correspondence. I mean, it may have frustrated him from time to time. And it would just, as a way of ending, I just wondered if you wanted to read a little bit from your.
Sure,
Your
just
memoir, just to give a sense of the man, because
just this one paragraph. In a state that is something like a reverie, I can hear Maxwell's voice. Sometimes I can make out what he's saying, and sometimes it is only the sound of him talking. Once, since he died, he has appeared in my dreams as an old man who embraced me and said, "I'm glad I had you for a father." I'm aware that Maxwell, I don't think I can do it. Okay. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Want me to read it?
Sure. I was just going to read that paragraph.
Okay.
And the last
Thank you,
part.
Deborah.
I was about right.
Okay.
Not that far.
I'm aware that Maxwell had grown fatigued by the effort of one day's following another, by having outlived his body, that is, and not much interested in going on without his wife, and that these are sufficient reasons to be grateful that his end was peaceful and without suffering. Even so, I am not resigned to his being gone. This is the contradiction at the heart of grief. There is no point at which I expect to say, I am happier than I was when he wasn't in the cemetery. We simply arrive eventually at a state of existence in which we are better able to bear the sadness. I keep a picture of Maxwell on my desk, and sometimes I forget it is there, and raise my eyes from what I am doing and wonder how it is possible to feel so strongly about someone who isn't here anymore.
That's so lovely.
Thank you, Deborah. Do you want me to read that letter on the?
Yes, if you can.
When my father gave up his job in the city and he and my mother moved to their house in Wellfleet, my father began cultivating an oyster bed in the harbor. Every Christmas, he sent the Maxwells 24 oysters. One year, Maxwell wrote to him, "They were, there is no other word, exquisite. The best oysters I ever tasted. Twice in 1 year this has happened to me." Emmy's father served us a bottle of Chateau Margaux, 1961, that had been given to him 7 years ago on his 80th birthday. And there is no better year or better wine for that year. And I realized that, alas, I have a palate for wine, even though I don't know a bloody thing about it. And now the Wellfleet oysters. I also thought, as champagne glasses were raised to you, of what it meant trudging, God damn it, what it meant trudging through the icy cold to get them for us. And who else would do it? Damn, sorry. The answer is nobody. There is no adequate way to say thank you. It isn't even very sensible to try. I mean, you don't thank people for being your friend. You thank God for your good fortune in having them as a friend.
Oh, thank you. I know we're going to have some questions in a moment, but just to end the podcast, is if there's anything else any of you wanted to throw in about Maxwell, editing, The New Yorker. There's a thing that he said towards the end of his life, I think, which was when he was doing his own writing, he asked, "Is it true?" Everything he wrote, he looked and is it true?
I asked myself, is it true?
I asked myself, is it true? It's still, I think all writers. I feel that all writers have to do that. I don't know whether you agree, Jenny.
Ask myself if it's true, meaning...
That when you read the stuff back that you've written.
I mean, I don't know if... I guess the question I have is it good? But there's a quote I love from Maxwell, which was really illuminating to me, because he was an autofictionalist, which is something we think of as kind of contemporary, and it's clearly not at all. But he talked explicitly in the same interview that you played the clip from about how memory is storytelling.
Yes.
So to write autobiography is also to write fiction. And he has a great quote, which is, "In talking about the past, we lie with every breath we draw."
Yeah.
So good.
That's brilliant. Thank you. We're going to have questions in a moment. Thank you, Alec. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Jenny. And thank you for being a lovely audience. It's been amazing for us to be here in New York. And always happy talking about William Maxwell, somebody who was as good at talking about books as he was, I think, at writing them. But if you haven't read So Long, See You Tomorrow, if there's nothing else, and if you're the sort of person who likes correspondence, do read The Element of Lavishness, because it is one of the, I think it is one of the great correspondences of the 20th century. But thank you. Thank you. Excellent. Right, question time. What is your favorite book or work by William Maxwell? This is not being recorded, so you can pass if you want. I'm going to start with you, Alec, because you've obviously read all of it.
Well, So Long, See You Tomorrow, but since the pandemic, I have every day read 4 or 5 pages of So Long, See You Tomorrow, so that I've been through it now 4 times since the pandemic, and probably had read it 10 times before that. And each time I find new things and am astonished by the meticulousness of its construction. Bill used to say every sentence in the book had been 5 or 6 other places before they found their home.
He actually used to do that. He used to cut the sentences out and stick them on and move them
Rubber
around.
cement.
Physically move them around.
Right. Yeah, well, I mean, it's easy now with the word processor, of course, to do that, but in the old days, you had to cut them out and
paste them.
And move them around. I remember
cut and paste.
him showing Eudora Welty how to do it, which was, Quite well, but So Long, See You Tomorrow is so extraordinarily crafted, and the echoes of the ways that themes are introduced and move in a kind of circular fashion. The idea of stepping through a door that you weren't meant to go through and you can't get back, can't find again to go out of, is repeated over and over in the lives of these other characters. It is also the most extraordinary book that I know of in American fiction, in the sense of it's sort of two books. It's an absolutely astonishing idea that you would be writing a memoir that would become this other thing, which is a novel.
Yeah.
Through the force of imagination.
Also, that I think
it's a wonderful book. And finally, it's a wonderful book because it's only about 135 pages long, and you can read it in an afternoon. And if you like it, you know that you can move on to other Maxwell.
Yeah. Also, one of the best dogs in literature.
Yes, great dog.
Very sad.
Very beautiful writing about grief in there. I'm not sure I've ever read a more powerful description of grief than what this little boy feels when his mother dies.
Yeah, couldn't bear it. Any other Maxwell tips from you guys? The stories, I would
fables.
Say. Yeah.
The Old Man with the Railroad Car.
The fables,
Which, by the way, I think were, in a sense, his response to Sylvia Townsend Warner's fairy stories. To a degree. I mean, he began writing them long before Sylvia Townsend Warner wrote the fairy stories. But they do have a kind of conversation back and forth sense to them, a resonance. They reverberate poetically in that sense.
Great. There's a question for me here. You played a role in the publication of Maxwell's fiction in the UK for the first time. How was it received, both critically and commercially? It was received extremely well, both critically and commercially. What I feel about Maxwell is that I've come across this all the time. It's a slow burn. People discover him. People recommend him. There are writers who will discover him and write about him. It's a little bit like the very first podcast we did was on a book by J.L. Carr called A Month in the Country, another short, brilliant novel. There's something about these books that it almost, you can give them to absolutely anybody. I mean, I often get, in fact, both of those books I give to people who say that they can no longer read fiction. And in most cases, as a sort of bibliotherapy, it works. But I think, it's an interesting, we didn't really get into why Maxwell's reputation as a writer didn't grow in the way that the quality of the work might suggest it had done. I feel that he's not disappeared, and that the more people talk about him and read him, the more he's kind of out there.
May I tell you just one quick story? I have a friend, Andre Bernard, who was an editor for many years, and when he was courting his wife, they went to they were going to go away for a weekend to a country inn or something like that, and the plan was each to bring the book that meant more to them than any other, and they both brought They Came Like Swallows.
Amazing.
which was an obscure.
Which came up because of COVID. He wrote about the 1918 flu pandemic, which killed his mother, and so that came. It was a book that became sort of talked about and shared then. And although that comes again in his book Ancestors, his family history, and then obviously in So Long, See You Tomorrow as well. So it's something that he keeps replaying. Two more very quick questions. One is, how does his writing relate to his editing? Not all editors are great writers. Anyone want to go for that? I mean, how does his editing relate to his writing?
I mean, I don't know, but I will just say the way he talked about his own writing, I related to very deeply. And I was surprised because I wouldn't have, So Long, See You Tomorrow and his stories have a very measured sense of control. I mean, you mentioned sentences getting moved around, but what surprised me is that the way he wrote apparently was very organic. And he had a quote about an interviewer asked him whether he had gotten better, sort of more expert as he went along, and he said, "I've never known what I was doing, only a feeling that I had to do it, really, but that surely there must be a better way of doing it, or a better person to do it. But something I couldn't quite let go of, that this was a thing you had to have, then finding your way to it. That the material is in the end your friend, and if you give yourself up to it entirely," and then he wandered off a little bit. That's exactly how I feel about, I mean, that's the only way I can find to write, and I also keep thinking there should be a better way or a better person. So I think if he had such a sense of the organic quality of the process, and I have to think that impacted his editing.
Yeah, he was always very, he didn't like reviewing. And in fact, he made a point of not doing it because he didn't want to upset. I mean, is that something for you? You kind of, if you're commissioning and publishing, it's a bit like being a publisher. You tend not to do reviewing for obvious reasons.
Yeah, I can.
Although he did say all he would want to do would be to just quote. If there was a book he loved, he just wanted to put lots of quotes from the book, and less judgment. One final question, which I'm afraid is just for me as well, which is to say, will you make this trip to the US an annual occurrence, please? Totally up to you. We would love to do that. And thank you, as I say, thank you all for making this possible. It's just a great pleasure for us to be here. I know Andy would be absolutely gutted. I'm hoping he stayed up late to watch this, and if he does, we miss you. But that is it, I think, for this evening. Thank you again to Jennifer Egan, Deborah Treisman, and Alec Wilkinson. And thank you all for being a marvelous audience. I'm sure some of you will be. I think we're decamping to a tavern nearby. I can't remember what it's called, but I'm sure you follow the crowd. We'll be going and having a drink after. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.